this is a proposal then for what the book, the two books, are broken down into these different sections, and we're going to go through these different sections one by one to kind of to unpick what happens within each of these sections and why we think they are sections, and some of the messages and the key points within them. Let me just very quickly go through these 7 different areas. We start with a section that deals with Samuel being introduced to us, and is really all about the transfer of power between Eli and Eli's sons, and then Samuel. Then we are introduced to Saul as a king in Israel, as the first king in Israel, and we have the rise and the fall of Saul. And though that rise and fall then are based around a particular set of events that we'll look at. And then we have 3 central sections which deal first with David being introduced, because Saul in the second section, chapters 8 to 15, has been cut off. David is introduced as the candidate, as it were, to replace Saul, and we have David's initial rise in Saul's eyes in those early chapters through his slaying of Goliath. And then we have the attitude of Saul changing and David becoming the enemy of Saul. And that section deals with David as an enemy of Saul, but still within the rough proximity of Saul, i.e. within and outside of Saul's court. Before then, we move to this, I'm going to propose as the central section of the 2 books, which deals with the transfer between David and Saul, as if we can imagine a graph with Saul's reign going down and David's reign kind of going up, and the graph kind of meets at the point where David's life is really lowest, in and around the passage that we've just read. And the reason that we read that little passage is because it is perhaps, and we don't want to be too dogmatic, because there are different ways that we can split up Samuel, and there are some things which we can see structure kind of overlapping these sections that we've divided it up the books into. It suggests that passage is perhaps the central section of Samuel, and there is some evidence for that, and it seems to accord well with some of the central themes of Samuel and the 2 books. Then we get the 5th section, where David's reign is consolidated in the first 10 chapters of 2nd of Samuel, and that's split up into a couple of sections where effectively we've got a civil war followed by David consolidating his reign against certain external tribes or different other nations in and around the land. And then we've got David's sin, which parallels Saul's sin, but unlike Saul, it doesn't lead to his ultimate failure. It leads to him rising again, but he pays a dear price for David's sin with Bathsheba and with Uriah. And then finally, we've got a kind of the tidying up, as it were, of the book, and we've got David's final song that he makes, and there is a parallel in the central part of his song with parts of how we start the book, or the 1st of Samuel, and then Solomon is established. So that's kind of a very brief overview of what we're going to go through. So if we go into the first section, the first section is bookended by an event which, by a phrase which occurs a couple of times in the book of Samuel, at the beginning and end of this section, and then later on towards the end, right at the end of the second book of Samuel. And then it's Elkanah goes up year to year on this routine journey that he makes, going from where he lives in Ramah to worship and then back again. And as Elkanah makes this passage, and this journey, in the same way, the 7 chapters end with Samuel making a similar journey in a similar passage at the end of this section. What's happened in between is that we have a problem identified, and then we have a solution provided to that problem, and then we have the outworking of the transfer between Eli's sons and how they are leading Israel astray, and the consequence of that, which Israel still has to endure, and eventually Samuel working through becoming the leader, the spiritual leader within Israel, and establishing right worship. And the structure within then this book, this section, is really divided into an introductory chapter where we have the problem laid out for us that Hannah has this adversary, which is the absence of spiritual leadership within Israel, and she therefore makes this prayer. And it is in chapter 2 then, when we have Hannah's prayer, that we have within Hannah's prayer a central couple of statements which summarize really what the entire book of Samuel is all about. And then the next couple of chapters goes on to describe the transfer between Samuel and the sons of Eli, and how the word is revealed to Samuel, and how he goes from not understanding or seeing the word to becoming the established and recognized prophet within Israel. And then the last few chapters, from chapters 4 to 7, deal with the removal of those sons of Eli and Eli's household, and the establishment of Samuel. So if we just look for a moment at Hannah's prayer in chapter 2, you can see in Hannah's prayer that there is a couple of different passages and themes which are mirrored across the prayer. And one of those things is the idea initially in verse 1 that it is God that has exalted Hannah. And we can see that parallels the end of the prayer, where it says that God exalts the horn of all of his anointed. And then it goes on to talk about how God is a rock, and how there is 2 senses in which God is a rock. One is that he is a rock, a source of strength for those that trust in him, and a thing that breaks those that do not trust in him. And so we see there that the bows of the mighty are broken, and they that stumbled are girded with strength. And this idea then is that God is there as a support and a strength to those that trust in him, and that he is a threat and a destructive force to those that lift themselves up in pride and do not trust in God. And we can see that it compares with verse 10, where it talks about the adversaries of Yahweh shall be broken to pieces. Out of heaven shall he thunder upon them. But in verse 9, God will keep the feet of his saints. He's this source of stability and strength. And then when we go in kind of a notch, as it were, or a verse in verses 5 and verse 8, we can see that a particular aspect is brought out, that God is helping those that cannot help themselves, that he helps those that are feeble or those that are poor. And that leads us then to the very succinct central passage, which summarizes what we're going to see time and time again as we go through the 2 books of Samuel, that it is God which is going to be working in the lives of the men and women that we meet, and those different characters who play out incredibly dramatic experiences and have very dramatic lives. And it is God that's working there to bring down those that make themselves high and lift themselves up, and that he's going to lift up those that are humble enough to accept his direction. And the two central characters are, of course, Saul, who lifts himself up, and David, who consistently throughout the two books looks to God for his instruction at the critical moments of his life. But there are plenty of other different people who experience the same influence of God on their lives. So Samuel himself is brought and lifted to become the prophet within Israel, and Eli and his sons are wiped out. The counsel of Ahithophel, who is lifted up and as if it is as God, is then brought down and is destroyed and leads to his suicide, whereas Hushai's counsel is then brought up. And there are many different people and characters that experience this influence from God. Now, when we just get to chapter 2, just after Hannah's prayer, there is a man of God which comes and gives Eli a warning and says to Eli that he has been selected and that the tribe of Levi have been selected, but that within that tribe his sons have not been doing the role that they should have been doing and leading Israel, and that they have been kicking at the offerings of God, and therefore they are going to be cut off and a new priest is going to be established. And within this warning there is then this central passage or phrase that this man of God says to Eli, and he says that God honors those, or that those that honor God he honors, and those that despise him will be lightly esteemed. And that's the first reflection of the essence of Hannah's prayer that we're about to see worked out now in the life of Eli and of his sons. And that begins then directly in the next chapter, where in chapter 3 we have Samuel, who is ministering unto Yahweh before Eli. And we're told at the beginning of chapter 3 that the word of Yahweh is precious in those days, but there is no open vision. So there is an absence of genuine prophets within Israel who can provide this direction. And this is contrasted then with the end of the chapter, where Samuel grows. In verse 19, Yahweh is with him, and did let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of Yahweh. And within this passage then we have a consistent dimness from Eli, but a revelation which is made to Samuel. And Eli, in verse 2, we see his eyes are dim, so that he cannot see. And surely that is a metaphor for the spiritual state of Eli at this time. And the lamp of God is almost out in the temple of Yahweh in verse 3. So we have these metaphors here for how the spiritual state of Israel has dimmed under the leadership of Eli, or the lack of. And then, as we know, as we go through, the word of God comes, or the voice of God comes to Samuel, and he doesn't recognize it at first until Eli has this light bulb moment, perceives that God is calling him, and so he suggests that Samuel responds in the way that he does. And so Samuel then hears the word of God, and he has to relay the warning back to Eli. And Eli accepts the warning, or it's more than a warning. It's a condemnation, isn't it? It's a foretelling of what's going to happen to Eli and his family. And Eli accepts it in verse 18. And throughout chapter 3, then, we have gone from Samuel ministering before the Lord, or unto Yahweh before Eli, to then becoming established as this prophet. and Eli has been given this message that he is going to, and his house is being replaced. Then when we get to chapter 4, we have the outworking of this promise or this message from God, where it begins with the Israelites being smitten, and therefore they decide to bring the Ark of God into battle with them in order to have it as a talisman and to protect them. And we see in verse 4 that it's Hophni and Phinehas who are with the Ark, and there is a great shout which goes out from Israel, and the Philistines don't know what's going on, and they realize then that the Ark of God is with the Israelites, and they are fearful, but instead of fleeing, they double down in verse 9, and we read in verse 9, "Be strong and quit yourselves like men, O ye Philistines, that ye be not servants unto the Hebrews." And the Philistines then fight, and Israel is smitten again. The ark is taken, the sons of Eli are slain, and then there is another great shout, and Eli doesn't know what the noise means, exactly like the Philistines. And so we can see that we get this pattern of ABC, ABC, with the smiting of Israel, the ark which is taken, or the ark which is being guided by Hophni and Phinehas, and then they are killed and the ark is taken. And then this great shout which surprises the Philistines or surprises Eli. And this chapter then leads to Eli dying and his house being almost wiped out. And the ark is taken by the Philistines, and then it continues through to the end, I think, of this section, where we see the Philistines in some ways treating the ark with a greater respect than the Israelites did, until the men of Kirjath-jearim come and fetch the ark of Yahweh back in chapter 7. And then Samuel comes in verse 9 of chapter 7, and he begins to make an offering for the people, on behalf of the people, and he gives them a warning and begins to take charge of Israel. And so it ends in verse 15 that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and he went from year to year in circuit to Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah. And so we end then with the first section. I'm going far too slow. So we end with the first section, and we can see clearly that it begins and it ends with the journey from year to year and the establishment of Samuel. Now when we move on to the next section, we have another chiastic structure which centers upon Samuel's address to the people as a reprimand that they have requested a king. So first of all, the section begins with the people requesting a king, and Saul is selected initially, and then he goes through a series of different events whereby he is obedient unto the things that Samuel asks him to do, and he is humble, and he demonstrates an attitude towards Samuel and towards God which is very positive. And so he is established as the king. He recognizes when he is established that, or he questions why he has been selected. So there is this humble attitude with David. He is with Samuel, and he is low in his own mind. And so he is lifted up then, and he's given this position within the kingdom as the king. And he's given an instruction in chapter 10 by Samuel that he is to go and he is to meet some other prophets, and he follows through on all of these instructions. And because he does these things, he's given in verse 9 a new heart, and eventually by lot he is selected, and then he is made king. And the first act that he does as king is to go and save part of his kingdom. He goes to save the men of Jabesh Gilead, and he rallies all of Israel and manages to rally an enormous army from Israel of over 300,000 men. And he goes and saves the men of Jabesh Gilead after 7 days. And in verse 13 of chapter 11, he acknowledges that it is God that has actually wrought this victory. So this first few chapters then, Saul is established, he's raised up, and he becomes king, and he's doing pretty well as king. And this leads us to this central chapter where Samuel then summarizes some of the history of Israel and provides a warning and a revelation to the people about what they have done in asking God for a king. I'll come back to that in a second. But it is after then this warning that things begin to go downhill for Saul, because Saul, instead of destroying and beating back the Philistines, or whoever it is that's fighting against Jabesh Gilead in chapter 11, the Ammonites, he's found with the people in verse 7 trembling. And although Jonathan is doing a decent job, it seems that Saul has lost a bit of his bottle, or the people have lost some of their confidence in him. And then he tarries another 7 days in verse 8, and he should have waited for Samuel, but he doesn't, and he offers on behalf of the people. And because he's taken things into his own hands, rather than being instructed by Samuel as he was previously when he was made a prophet, he now has the punishment for this in verse 14, where the kingdom is not going to continue. So one mistake, one parallel mistake to the to what he did before in helping the men of Jabesh Gilead, and he is going to have the kingdom removed because God seeks a man after his own heart in verse 14. And then it goes on, and there are other chapters in chapter 14 where Jonathan really leads a victory against the Philistines, and Saul, instead of accepting this victory, puts a bit of a dampener on it by first by seeing the Philistines as his enemies exclusively, and then by putting these strange rules and restrictions in place, which Jonathan in his ignorance breaks. And then Jonathan is taken by lot in the same way that Saul is taken by lot at the beginning of the passage. And Jonathan escapes, but Saul then goes and compounds his earlier sin by, in that next event, being given a further instruction by Samuel. So he's given 3 instructions by Samuel, and this second one then he also breaks, and or this third one he breaks, which is to go and kill all of the Amalekites, which he doesn't. And so Samuel and Saul meet again, and Saul pleads for the kingdom, but Samuel says no, and the kingdom is taken away. So this passage then, it begins and ends with a significant interaction between Samuel and Saul. And interestingly, if we just go back to 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 9, where we see Saul at the beginning, when we are introduced to Saul, is that he is searching after his father's asses. And in verse 9 we read, "Before time in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, thus he spake, Come and let us go to the seer, for he that is now called a prophet was before time called a seer." So Samuel there, or Saul rather, is inquiring of God. And we see a parallel then which breaks outside of this structure and goes right to the end of Saul's life. We're introduced and he's inquiring of God, and at the end of Saul's life he's also inquiring of God. But God is not answering him then, as we'll see in a few moments. And so he inquires of the woman of Endor. And that kind of charts the kind of the narrative arc of Saul's life. He's there at the beginning, he's inquiring of God, he's asking, and by the end of his life, he's no longer inquiring of God, and therefore he is cast to one side. And in the middle of this section, then, we have Samuel's speech to the people. And the center of Samuel's speech, then, is to say, well, you've got a king, and you've asked for a king, and you've got a king, and it puts the people and the king together. And there is a point that Samuel makes at the center of this passage, which is effectively to say, God should have been your king, and God is still going to be Israel's king. And the only way that that can happen then is that the actual human king that is selected is of the same heart as God. And then in effect, God would really be their king. And this is what we move on in the next section to be introduced to David in chapter 16, who is selected because his heart is the same as God's heart. So we move on to the next section then, and here we are introduced to David. And David is selected by God and anointed by Samuel. And this section begins with David being brought out of obscurity. He's the youngest son in his father's household, and it ends with him not in obscurity, but as a fugitive on the run from Saul. So there's a lot then that happens throughout this next section. But we just want to focus on one little aspect of it, which is when we move into chapter 17, Goliath and David's defeat of Goliath, and then his subsequent attacks against and wars against the Philistines are really brought together in the same passage, and at the beginning of chapter 18, where we see the thing that brought David into prominence and him rising up and being given favor in Saul's house is also the thing then that turns Saul away from him and pushes David away from Saul's house. So it's the same event which means that David both rises and then falls within Saul's kingdom. And again, that harks back to the prayer of Hannah and the principle that seems to run throughout the books of Samuel, of God lifting up and bringing low. Not that that necessarily is God bringing David low in this case, but there is a parallel to be made between what happens to Samuel, what happens to David in this passage. Because we see that in chapter 17, he goes through and he slays Goliath and he beats the Philistines. And so in chapter 18, at the beginning of chapter 18, Saul takes him into his own house. Previously, it seems, although David has sometimes been in Saul's court because he's been playing for Saul, here this is a more permanent removal from David's house and being brought into Saul's house. He establishes this relationship with Jonathan, a very close relationship, and he is established before the people in verse 5 of chapter 18, where David goes out and he behaves himself wisely, and Saul sets him over men of war, and he's accepted. And then, as a result of what he has been asked to do, which is to continue in fighting against the Philistines, and what he's just come from doing with Goliath, it's the same thing in verse 8, and the people's response and praise of David, which means that Saul is very wroth and he eyes David from that day forwards. He casts a javelin at David. He becomes afraid of David. He asks David in verse 12 to depart out of his presence. He removes him, and he then seeks to kill him, and in verse 29 David becomes Saul's enemy. So we can see that in the space of a chapter, David goes through a huge set of changes in Saul's opinion, from doesn't really know who he is at the beginning of the chapter, or at the end of chapter 17, through to loving him, inviting him into his house, and then rejecting him. And this then passage or section continues, and what demarcates this section from the next section is that David, although he falls from favor within Saul's house, he is still within the proximity of the court. And it's only at the end of that section, when he doesn't really know what's going to happen until it has it confirmed in chapter 20, where Jonathan fires the arrows and David and Jonathan part. And so this section ends then, and we arrive at what we suggest is this long middle section. And this then begins with David being a fugitive, and it ends with the death of Saul. And it also begins with David being a fugitive and fleeing to Gath. And towards the end of this passage, David goes back to Gath and back to the Philistines. And in between, there are a couple of events which seem to identify 1 Samuel chapter 25 and Nabal and Abigail as the center of this particular passage, which is the center of the two books. So if we just go to chapter 23, we can see that there is a sequence that happens in beginning of chapter, or through chapter 23 and into chapter 24, which is then repeated in chapter 26, which it begins with David is betrayed by the Ziphites there in verse 19. Then came up the Ziphites to Saul to Gibeah, saying, "Doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds?" And they give David up to Saul. And so Saul comes to try to attack and to find David. And so into chapter 24 then, David comes into close proximity with Saul, and he has an opportunity to kill him, but he doesn't take that opportunity. And instead, as we know, he cuts a little bit of the skirt of Saul, and then he goes in verse 8 and he bows himself down to the earth before David and before Saul, and he petitions Saul and says, "Why is it that you are fleeing after me?" And so Saul repents. And if we skip over chapter 25, this is exactly what happens in chapter 26. The Ziphites come, they betray Saul again. They betray David to Saul. Saul pursues David. David has another opportunity to kill Saul. He doesn't take it. And he has learnt a lesson from chapter 25. And so he is even more fervent in his rejection of Abishai's suggestion that he goes and kills Saul. And he says in verse 10 of chapter 26, "Furthermore, as Yahweh liveth, Yahweh might smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. Yahweh forbid that I should stretch forth my hand against Yahweh's anointed. But I pray thee, take thou now the spear that's at the bolster and the cruse of water, and let us go." The point being that David is going to refuse to kill Saul because of the principle that is there at the beginning of the book within Hannah's prayer. It's God that lifts up and God that brings low. And so David reveals himself again to Saul. Saul repents and he goes home. And in between these two passages then, we have the event which in some ways is a bit of a tangent to the narrative, isn't it? It's a bit different from what happens with Saul and David and their constant interaction. Now it's about David who's going to Nabal and Abigail. And the roles in this little passage revert as David takes on the role of Saul and goes to pursue after Nabal and to take things into his own hands and doesn't inquire of God. And Abigail has to intervene, and she intervenes and in the same way that David does, and she bows herself down in verse 23. She lights off her ass and fell before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground. So the roles have swapped here, and Abigail is playing David, and David is playing Saul. And the thing that David was about to do was to take matters into his own hands. And that contrasts with the attitude that he's had up until this point, which is a consistent inquiry at God. What should I do? In chapter 23 in particular, that's brought out, whereas every step of the way, David asks God what he should do. He hasn't done that here, and he's gone, and he's almost about to slay Nabal. And Abigail intervenes, and then she petitions David, and in her petition, we have some of the principles that run throughout the book of Samuel that are picked up in the end of the books of Samuel in David's prayer, and right at the beginning in Hannah's prayer too, where she recognizes a few things which demonstrate a real spiritual insight. She recognizes that God fights for David and that David fights for God, and that they are bound together, that David is a man after God's own heart. She recognizes that Saul has been risen up and is pursuing after David, and that despite this, David is ultimately going to be triumphant, and he's the one that's going to become king. And she recognizes that it is God that intervenes and removes the enemies of David. And she says, as a sling, he shall sling the enemies of David out, as out the middle of a sling. That's takes you back, of course, to David defeating Goliath, which is that seminal moment really in the rise of David, puts David on the map, doesn't it? Because he slings that sling. If you wanted something from the first half of that chapter of the whole 2 books of Samuel, you'd possibly pick out that event with David and Goliath as demonstrating the difference in attitude between Saul and David and the reasons. And this is what David is going to do, and it is what God did, isn't it, back in whatever chapter 10 or whatever it is. It's what 17. It's what God did, that he directed that stone rather than David, and that he can do that again. And the other thing then that David is told, or that Abigail says, is, I've stopped you from shedding blood causeless. And that is the thing which David is stopped from doing now, but in the second half of the book of Samuel is really the event that characterizes that second half of David's life, isn't it? His sin, where he does shed blood causeless. So I suggest here that we've got a lot of the elements of the 2 books brought together in this woman who plays the role of David in what seems to be this central passage where David learns his lesson, the lesson that he knew in the previous chapter when he didn't kill Saul, and the lesson that he then has remembered in the next chapter where he certainly isn't going to kill Saul. We move then on to the next section, which is 10 chapters where Saul has died at the end of the book. But in the second book of Samuel, then we have the first 10 chapters as a single section, which deals with the establishment of David's reign. And the first part of that section is to do with David being established against Saul's house still. So it's about civil war in the first 4 chapters. And then in chapters 5 to 10, it's about David establishing his house, or God establishing his house, and particularly with a focus on Jerusalem and a focus on David subduing other nations that are in and around the area. But we can see here that these first 4 chapters seem to have a pretty strong chiastic pattern, where it begins with a man that claims he's killed Saul, and David executes him, and it ends with men that actually kill Ishbosheth, and David executes them. And as we come in, we can see that David laments for Saul, and near the end of these 4 chapters, David laments or mourns for Abner. And then we have a contrast in the kind of the C passages where David is kind to the men of Jabesh Gilead because of what they did to the house of Saul, and took the body of Saul and the body of his sons and brought them back, whereas he is reprimands Joab for his cruelty for killing Abner. And then either side of the central passage, we have Abner, first of all, working to make Ishbosheth king, and in contrast to David, in opposition to David, and that leads to Asahel's death. And then on the other side of the central passage, we have, because of what's almost a slightly arbitrary kind of event, with not exactly arbitrary, but not, well, because Abner goes and takes Saul's concubines, and Ishbosheth gets upset by that, Abner completely changes, and then he works to make David king. So plot D and part D then are parallels with Abner trying to make Ishbosheth king, and then trying to make David king. First one leading to Asahel's death, and then the second one leading to Abner's death because he killed Asahel. And in the center of these passages, then, we have chapter 3, which and the first 6 verses of chapter 3, which within these 4 chapters, they're all about David's family being established. And this is what these 6 verses at the beginning of chapter 3 summarize, where it says that there is a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. David waxes stronger and stronger. The house of Saul waxes weaker and weaker. And then we get the list of David's sons, and that begins in verse 2, and to David were sons born in Hebron, and it ends in verse 5, these were born to David in Hebron. So the point being, the center here of these 4 chapters, that David is being established, just as we know this whole transfer is going on between Saul and David. He's getting stronger, and Saul's house is getting weaker. And verse 6 is kind of the end of, is paralleled with verse 1 there, where the war is ongoing, but Abner is making himself strong for the house of Saul. This goes on then to the second part of this section, where it seems to be all about the final establishment of David's house. And first of all, David takes Zion, and God is with him and is establishing him. And there is this focus then by David upon Jerusalem. He wants to bring the ark back to Jerusalem, and then everything he's established within Jerusalem. And it's almost as if leading up to chapter 10, David is searching for things to do. He's searching for people that he wants to help, because he is being consolidated in his position. He's no longer having to fight and battle quite as much, although there is lots of fighting and battling going on. He recognizes that God has established him, and so he wants to then do something for other people. And he starts with trying to do things for people, for God, in chapter 7. And then when God rejects that offer, or says it's not necessary, then he says, well, maybe I can do something for the house of Saul in chapter 9, and I can help out the house of Saul. And so he tries to do that. But we can see that this passage ends then towards the end of chapter 10, where there is further battles. And within the center of this passage, then, we have 2 Samuel chapter 7, where David's the promises are made to David by God. And we won't go into the detail of this passage, other than to say that God's response to David's request to build him a house is to say that he doesn't need a house. He's established both David and Israel, and he's going to establish David's house forever. And David's response in the second part of that chapter just mirrors God's own response to him, where David recognizes that God has established. He recognizes that God has established Israel, and he thanks God and requests that God does indeed establish his house forever. But this is this important high point, David having been established, no longer any civil war that exists within the land, other nations which exist which still need fighting against, but that David is doing this job, and that God has established him in this position. It then leads us to the penultimate section, which we can split up and subdivide into three different other sections, which first of all deals with David's sin and that sin being revealed. And then it deals with the kind of the first round of Absalom leaving and then returning back to Jerusalem, and then the proper betrayal that Absalom makes of David. And we can see that the passage begins with David tarrying at Jerusalem. And as we've just said in the previous kind of section, it's almost as if David is beginning to lack a little bit of the initiative, and maybe that's probably a little bit harsh, but it's Joab that leads in chapter 10 the battle, whereas David stays behind. And that happens again in verse 1 of chapter 11, where David stays behind and Joab goes off to fight. So it begins then, the passage begins the first couple of chapters with David at Jerusalem, Joab going off to fight. And David, of course, goes to inquire of Bathsheba. And as we've mentioned, there are only a few occasions where this word for inquire happen, which is one in there is a usual word for inquire which is used all the time, and then there is a kind of a stronger word which seems to be associated with worship, and it's that other word which is used by Saul back in 1 Samuel chapter 9 when he first comes into contact with Samuel, and it's also that word which is used at the end of Saul's life when he inquires, worships almost at the woman from Endor, and it's also used here then in David's life that he goes and inquires after Bathsheba. So there's this slightly more intense inquiry than David has made perhaps elsewhere, or that Saul made elsewhere. So David inquires after Bathsheba and takes her, and she has a child, leads to Uriah's death. Bathsheba mourns, and in the center then in chapter 12 it's revealed to David what his punishment is going to be, because of what he has done, a fitting punishment, because he's killed Uriah and taken another man's wife. His wives are going to be taken, and the sword is not going to leave his family before again. David repents, and he is told that he's not going to be cut off in the same way, and then the child dies and Bathsheba mourns again. Then Solomon is born, and it ends with Joab fighting, David coming to complete that fight, and then everyone returns to Jerusalem. So again, it's a kind of a neat little section in chapters 11 and 12, and within that there is an interesting passage which focuses upon what happens between David and Uriah, because clearly David's house has been established, and that's what chapter 7 has been all about and what God has said. And therefore David's sin is particularly grievous because of the contrast and the relief that Uriah's attitude puts against David's own attitude in this case. Because it begins with the king in his own house, David in his own house. He sees Bathsheba, he brings Bathsheba into his own house, and then she goes back to her house. And then there's this whole passage where David tries to persuade Uriah to go to his own house, and he doesn't. And then he tries to persuade him again, and he doesn't. And so he has to kill him. And then ultimately Bathsheba ends up permanently in David's house. And in the center of that kind of request from David is this attitude of Uriah, who says, well, the ark's not in my house, so how could I go to my house and lie with my wife, which is so many steps removed from David, who is in his own house and has got another man's wife in his own house. So you can see the contrast there. And it's almost as if Uriah in some ways mirrors Abigail in the attitude and that the instruction that they give to David. Of course, Uriah's attitude and instruction is too late, because it's too late for Bathsheba, and because of that David is committed, and therefore he suffers with his life. But this then is the first couple of chapters, and we go on then to chapters 13 and 14. And in chapters 13 and 14 it deals with Amnon, who loves Tamar, and who therefore takes her, and then who hates her. And we won't say any more about that because we're pretty much run out of time. But we'll move on to just the last couple of sections very quickly. So this is the third part of this penultimate section, where we have Absalom's betrayal. And Absalom betrays, David flees, he gets tricked by Ziba, and then he gets cursed by Shimei. And within the center of that, then we have the counsel of Ahithophel and the counsel of Hushai contrasted. And at first, the counsel of Ahithophel is as if it is the counsel of God. But then in the very next chapter, the counsel of Hushai defeats the counsel of Ahithophel, because it is the counsel of God. Because we're told that God establishes the counsel of Hushai to beat the counsel of Ahithophel. So you've got another example of all the way back to Hannah, where the Ahithophel is raised up high, and then he's brought low within a few verses. And then the same with Absalom, who dies, and after he is killed by Joab, then Shimei, David, who has fled from Jerusalem, begins his return back to Jerusalem, and he meets the same people back in his return to Jerusalem. He meets Shimei and he meets Ziba. He returns and ends with Sheba's betrayal, which is eventually put down, and David is established in Jerusalem. And so in the final passage, the final section, we have a shorter section which perhaps goes into the first couple of chapters of Kings, because then Solomon is established and we get Adonijah who rises. But just 2 points to make, really. One of them is that Saul's sons, there is a famine which is caused by Saul's sons. The land is cursed because of Saul's sons. And we get the same phrase that we got right at the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 1, with the idea that year by year this famine has happened. Year by year, Hannah felt the curse of the sons of Eli. And now year by year, the land is being cursed because of the sons of Saul, who have not been avenged by the Gibeonites. And so that has to happen. And so Saul's sons die. And we get a fitting kind of end, but also a little mirror back to the very beginning, perhaps to the end of Saul's family, completely wiped out. The transfer has happened. And now David begins the end of his life and his own transfer to Solomon. And we see finally that David has this song that he gives at the end, near the end of his life. And the middle, the central portion of that song is an echo, really, of the same sentiments that we found in Hannah's song, and in some ways the same sentiments that we found at the very beginning, at the very middle, with Abigail's petition. It's all about the fact that God is the one that's doing all of the instructing and the lifting up and the casting low. And so he says that with the merciful thou wilt show thyself merciful, and with the upright man thou wilt show thyself upright. It's the same message. With the pure thou wilt show thyself pure, and with the froward thou wilt show thyself unsavoury. And the afflicted people thou wilt save, but thine eyes are upon the haughty, that thou mayest bring them down. And so this then is the message and some of the structure, or proposed structure of Samuel, and some of the lessons that are brought out. It's about the political transfer of power between David and Saul, the rise of David's household and its establishment, the mirrors between the errors of Saul and the errors of David, but the attitude which is fundamentally different, and therefore the difference in result, which is David is not taken away because his heart is right with God, and he is a humble man despite the errors that he makes, whereas Saul's heart is not right. And the exhortation, of course, is for us to take and to think about Hannah's prayer, the message of Abigail, and David's song, that it is God which establishes us, and that we are to be humble before him and to trust in his strength and not our own. Thank you.